People always ask me the same question when they find out I used to work as a 911 dispatcher. What's the worst call you ever took? Most of them expect some dramatic story about a shooting, a hostage situation, or a high-speed chase. Hollywood has done a fantastic job convincing people that dispatchers spend every shift talking to action heroes. The truth is much less glamorous. Most of the time, you're telling someone how to perform CPR on their grandfather. You're calming down a teenager who just watched his father collapse in the kitchen. You're trying to figure out where someone is because the only thing they're able to tell you is, "I'm near a gas station." You become very good at solving puzzles while someone else's life depends on how quickly you can put the pieces together. It's a strange job. You hear the worst moments of people's lives, and then you go home, buy groceries, argue with your internet provider, and wonder if you should finally replace that frying pan you've been using since college. Life doesn't stop just because you've spent 12 hours listening to other people's emergencies. My name's Daniel. I worked night shifts for Seattle's Emergency Communications Center for a little over 8 years. I loved nights. No supervisors wandering around every 5 minutes pretending to check in. No endless meetings. No politicians touring the building to shake hands for the cameras. Just coffee, computer screens, and the comforting sound of controlled chaos. Our unofficial slogan was simple: if everyone's yelling, nobody yells. It didn't make much sense unless you'd worked there. The rookie dispatchers always panicked during their first month. Someone would scream, someone else would cry, a baby wouldn't be breathing, a car would be upside down in a ditch. Meanwhile, the experienced dispatchers would be sitting there asking questions in the same tone you'd use to order lunch. People thought we were heartless. We weren't. If we panicked too, nobody would be left to help. One of the new guys asked me during his first week how I stayed so calm. I told him the truth. You don't get paid to have emotions. You get paid to borrow them later. He stared at me like I'd just revealed the meaning of life. I probably should have told him the healthier answer. Instead, I offered him another cup of terrible break room coffee. That coffee deserved its own criminal investigation. I'm convinced it stripped paint off the walls. Night shifts develop a weird sense of humor because the alternative is crying in the parking lot. There were 6 of us assigned that Thursday night. Maria sat across from me. She had worked dispatch even longer than I had, and had somehow become everyone's work mom. She kept aspirin, cough drops, phone chargers, snacks, and enough pens to supply an elementary school. Then there was Kevin. Kevin believed every conspiracy theory ever invented. Government cover-ups, aliens, secret underground tunnels. He once spent 20 minutes trying to convince me pigeons were surveillance drones. I asked him why the government would build robots that kept flying into windows. He didn't appreciate the question. The shift had been fairly quiet. If you've ever worked emergency services, you know that can change without warning. At around 1 in the morning, we dealt with a drunk guy insisting someone had stolen his car. The police found it exactly where he'd parked it. At 1:38, a teenager called because his friend had glued his hand to a kitchen counter. Don't ask. I never learned why. At 1:56, someone reported hearing a mountain lion behind their house. It turned out to be a very angry raccoon. Kevin still insisted raccoons were government experiments. I stopped asking questions years earlier. By 2 o'clock, I figured we'd probably make it through the rest of the shift with nothing more exciting than paperwork. At exactly 2:17, my headset chimed. Another incoming emergency call. I clicked accept. 911, what's the address of your emergency? There was no answer, just breathing. Slow, unsteady. I glanced at the screen. No caller ID. Not unusual. People block their numbers all the time. I tried again. 911, can you hear me? A little girl answered so quietly I almost missed it. Please, don't hang up. Every dispatcher recognizes that kind of voice. Not because it's loud, but because the fear is unmistakable. I'm here, I said. You're not alone. Tell me what's going on. A few seconds passed before she spoke again. There's a man downstairs. I immediately opened the incident form. Okay, what's your address? She answered without hesitation. 15 Ash Street. I typed it into the dispatch system. A red message appeared, address not found. That wasn't impossible. Sometimes new developments or newly assigned addresses hadn't been added to the database yet. I deleted the address and entered it again. Same result. Can you repeat the address for me? I asked. 15 Ash Street. She sounded confused now, as if I were the one asking strange questions. What city are you in? Seattle. I switched to another mapping database. Nothing. No Ash Street. No similar spelling. No nearby match. It was as if the street didn't exist. A floorboard creaked through the phone. The girl took a quick breath. He's coming upstairs. Every instinct I had kicked in. Address or no address, this was now an active threat. I raised one hand to get Maria's attention. She looked over. I pointed at my screen. She immediately understood something was wrong. While I kept talking to the girl, Maria quietly walked behind me and looked at the monitor. "Listen to me," I said. "What's your name?" "Sarah." "How old are you, Sarah?" 12. "Are your parents home?" She hesitated. "They were." That answer caught my attention. "What do you mean by they were?" Sarah didn't reply. Another floorboard creaked, closer than before. The sound of someone climbing an old wooden staircase, one step at a time. She lowered her voice. "He doesn't run." I frowned. "What?" "He never runs." Another step, another creak. I looked at Maria. She mouthed one word. "Trace." I nodded and initiated the call trace. Normally we'd have something within seconds. A cell tower, coordinates, a carrier, anything. Instead, the loading circle stayed on the screen. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then a message appeared that I'd never seen before. Location unavailable. Not unknown. Not error. Just location unavailable. Sarah spoke again. "I think." She stopped. Another floorboard creaked. "I think he knows I'm awake." I was about to answer when I heard another voice through the phone. A man. Quiet. Calm. "Sarah." She gasped, then whispered 4 words I'll never forget. "He found the stairs." I wish I could tell you that the next few minutes made sense. They didn't. The first thing they teach you as a dispatcher is not to jump to conclusions. Systems fail. People panic. Addresses get mixed up. Cell towers go down. There was always a logical explanation if you looked hard enough. That's what I told myself while I looked at the screen for the 3rd time. No Ash Street. No nearby match. Nothing. I wasn't ready to believe the computer was wrong, but I wasn't ready to believe a frightened 12-year-old was making up her own address either. "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "I need you to stay with me, okay?" "Okay." "Is your bedroom door locked?" "Yes." "Good. Leave it locked." I opened another map while we talked. Different database. Same result. Nothing. Across from me, Maria had already stopped pretending to work on her own calls. She leaned over just enough to see my monitor without getting in the way. I didn't even have to explain what was happening. She could tell from my face. I covered my microphone for a second. "Can you find Ash Street?" She started typing. A few seconds later, she quietly shook her head. "I've got nothing." That wasn't the answer I wanted. I uncovered the microphone. "Sarah, can you hear him now?" There was a pause before she answered. "I think he's on the stairs." "You think?" "I can hear them. The stairs. The steps." She was breathing harder now. 1. Another pause. 2. I frowned. "Sarah?" "He keeps stopping." I looked at Maria again. Neither of us said anything. We both knew what she meant. She wasn't counting stairs. She was counting footsteps. "Sarah," I said, "listen to me carefully. I need you to tell me if you can see anyone outside your window." "I can't." "Why not?" "The curtains are closed." "Can you move them just enough to look outside?" She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was even quieter than before. "I don't want him to hear me." That was a perfectly reasonable answer. If she believed someone was inside the house, moving across the room could make enough noise to give away where she was. I couldn't argue with that. "It's okay," I said. "Don't do anything that makes you feel unsafe." She didn't respond. For a second, I thought we'd lost the call. Then I heard her breathing again. Behind me, someone pulled up another chair. It was Kevin. He looked at my screen before looking at me. "No address?" I shook my head. "No trace?" I pointed at the monitor. He stared at it for a moment before quietly saying, "That's strange." Coming from Kevin, that almost made me laugh. This was the same guy who thought pigeons worked for the government. If he thought something was strange, we'd officially entered new territory. I asked Sarah another question. "Do you know who the man is?" "No." "Have you ever seen him before?" "No." "Did you hear him come into the house?" She stopped. "I don't remember." That answer bothered me. People remember someone breaking into their house, a window shattering, a door opening, footsteps, something. "Sarah," I said, "is there anyone else in the house with you?" "My mom and dad were." The way she said it made my stomach tighten. Not were. I looked over at Maria. She'd caught it too. Before I could ask what she meant, another floorboard creaked through the headset. This one sounded closer than the last. Sarah inhaled sharply. "He's still coming." I checked the call timer. Almost 8 minutes. That was a long time for someone to stay on the line during an active emergency, without us getting officers moving toward them. Every second felt wasted. I waved our shift supervisor over. Mark walked across the room, glanced at the screen, and immediately understood why I'd called him. "What's the address?" he asked. 15 Ash Street. He frowned. "Never heard of it." "The system hasn't either." He looked at the red warning on my monitor. "Address not found." "Tri-county records." "Already did." "Archived maps?" Maria answered before I could. "Nothing." Mark folded his arms. That was unusual. I'd worked with him for years. He always had another idea. This time, he didn't. For the first time since the call started, nobody at my desk knew what to do next. Then Sarah spoke again, very quietly. "I don't hear the stairs anymore." I leaned forward. "What do you hear?" "Nothing." I wasn't sure whether that was better or worse. Then she whispered something that made every person standing around my desk stop moving. "I think he's outside my room." The word stayed with me for a second. "I think he's outside my room." It wasn't what she said that bothered me. It was how she said it. She wasn't screaming anymore. She wasn't crying. She sounded like she'd accepted that whoever was outside her bedroom door was eventually going to come in. People don't usually get calmer when they're more frightened. They get quieter. There's a difference. I leaned closer to my headset. "Sarah, I need you to stay with me. Can you still hear me?" "Yes." "Good." I looked over at Mark. He was already on another computer, searching old property records while Maria went through archived street indexes. Neither of them looked particularly hopeful. Kevin had stopped making jokes altogether. That was probably the strangest thing I'd seen all night. I went back to Sarah. I asked whether she had a charger in her room. She said she did, but her phone wasn't plugged in. When I asked how much battery she had left, she wasn't sure, so I told her to check. A few seconds later, she quietly said it was at 32%. I remember thinking we still had some time. Or so I thought. I needed something the computers couldn't give me, so I asked her to describe the house instead. At first, she sounded confused, but then she told me it was a white 2-story house with blue shutters. I wrote every detail on my notepad. White house. Blue shutters. 2 stories. Mark glanced at my notes and asked about the neighborhood, so I asked Sarah what was nearby. She told me there was a park and a church. When I asked if there was a school close by, she said there used to be one. It burned down. That answer caught my attention. I wasn't even sure why. Maybe because it was oddly specific. Maybe because 12-year-olds don't usually describe places that way. Before I could ask another question, Sarah whispered my name. "Daniel, I'm here." I think he touched the door. I held my breath and listened. At first, I heard nothing. Then came a faint sound. It wasn't knocking. It wasn't scratching. It sounded like someone slowly dragging their fingers across old wood. It lasted only a few seconds before everything went quiet again. "Sarah, stay where you are." "I'm trying." "You're doing great." I meant that. People think dispatchers spend their time giving instructions. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is convince someone they aren't facing something alone. I could hear her trying to steady her breathing. Then she quietly told me something her father used to say whenever she was scared. He said to stay quiet. Those words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded remembered. At that moment, Mark placed a folded sheet of paper beside my keyboard. It was a printout from the city's archived property database. Without saying a word, he tapped one line with his finger. Ash Street. For a second, I honestly thought I was reading it wrong. I picked up the paper. There it was. Ash Street. It wasn't in any current city records, but it had existed. My heart started beating a little faster. "We found it?" I asked. Mark gave a slow nod. "It existed." Maria looked over from her computer. "When?" Mark kept reading before quietly answering. "It doesn't anymore." I looked back at Sarah's call. For the first time since she'd given me the address, I knew she hadn't made it up. Ash Street had been real, at some point. "Mark." He was already reading farther down the report. His expression changed. "What is it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned the paper toward me. Near the bottom was a single note. "Street permanently removed following residential fire." I felt something tighten in my stomach. A residential fire. My mind immediately jumped back through the conversation. My mom and dad were. The school burned down. "I can smell smoke." I hadn't thought much about those comments when she first made them. Now they all seemed connected. "Daniel?" Sarah's voice pulled me back. "I'm here." "It smells funny." "What does?" "Smoke." The room around me suddenly felt much smaller. I looked at Mark. He was still reading. His face had gone pale. How long ago? I asked. He turned the page over. 19 years. 19 years. I looked back at my monitor. The call was still connected. Sarah was still breathing quietly into the phone. And somehow, I was talking to a little girl describing a house that, according to the records sitting beside my keyboard, had burned to the ground nearly 2 decades earlier. I wish I could tell you I stopped believing what I was seeing. I didn't. I just kept looking for another explanation. There had to be one. Cities change street names all the time. Records get lost. Databases aren't perfect. Maybe Sarah was hiding somewhere in an old neighborhood that hadn't been updated properly. It wasn't a great explanation. But it was better than the alternative. Mark took the printout from my desk and disappeared into the supervisor's office. A minute later, he came back carrying an old binder that looked like it had spent years collecting dust on a shelf. I found the archive reference, he said quietly. Maria pulled another chair over, and before long the three of us were buried in old records while I stayed on the phone with a little girl who sounded more frightened every minute. I needed to keep her talking, so I asked her to describe her room. She told me her bed was beside the window. The walls were yellow, the hallway outside was dark, and from her bedroom she couldn't actually see the staircase because it turned before reaching the second floor. I wrote every detail down. Yellow bedroom, white house, blue shutters, staircase turns left. None of those details sounded unusual. That was exactly what made them so unsettling. They were too ordinary to sound invented. Before I could ask anything else, Maria leaned toward her monitor. I found something. Mark and I looked over. It wasn't a police report. It was an old newspaper article. The date at the top caught my attention immediately. 19 years earlier. The headline read, "Family of 3 killed in late-night house fire." Nobody said a word. Maria opened the article while I looked back at my monitor. Sarah was still there. Still breathing. Still waiting for me to speak. "My room smells funny," she said quietly. "What does it smell like?" "Smoke." I glanced back at the newspaper. One paragraph mentioned that several neighbors reported smelling smoke before anyone noticed flames coming from the house. I didn't like where my thoughts were heading. Not one bit. Mark continued reading until he suddenly stopped. "The father tried to get upstairs. I looked at him." "What?" "He escaped the fire, then went back inside." The room fell silent. I turned my attention back to Sarah. I asked whether her dad was downstairs. She thought he was. She'd heard him shouting earlier, but she couldn't make out the words. After a moment, she added something that made my stomach tighten. "I think he was looking for me." Every instinct told me not to look at the newspaper again. I did anyway. One sentence had been highlighted years before. Witnesses reported hearing the father repeatedly call his daughter's name before the second floor collapsed. I felt my mouth go dry. "Daniel? I'm here. My dad always tells me to stay in my room if something bad happens." "I'm sure he does. I don't think he knows where I am." For a moment, nobody in the dispatch center moved. Even the other dispatchers had stopped taking calls they weren't assigned to. Everyone was listening. Nobody understood what was happening. But everyone understood that something wasn't right. Maria zoomed in on an old photograph attached to the newspaper archive. It showed a white 2-story house, blue shutters, a wooden porch. I didn't need to ask for the address. I already knew it. "I think this is her house," Maria whispered. Before I could answer, Sarah spoke again. "Daniel, I'm here. I can hear someone downstairs." I asked if she thought it was her father. She listened carefully before answering. "I don't know." "What do you hear?" She was quiet for several seconds. "He's calling my name." For the first time that night, I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe her father had found her. Maybe this nightmare was finally ending. Then Sarah quietly said something that erased that hope. "It isn't my dad's voice." A second later, a man's voice came through the phone. Not loudly, not angrily, just clearly enough for every person standing around my desk to hear. "Sarah." Nobody in the room moved, because this time, the voice hadn't come from somewhere upstairs. It sounded much closer, almost as if the man was standing right beside the phone. Nobody spoke. Not me, not Maria, not Mark. The only sound in the room was Sarah's breathing coming through my headset. I looked around the dispatch floor. Every dispatcher who wasn't handling an active emergency had stopped what they were doing. Nobody understood what was happening. But everyone understood they were listening to something they would never forget. I forced myself to focus. "Sarah," I said, "I need you to stay with me." "I'm trying." I asked her to tell me everything she could hear without moving from where she was. For several seconds, she didn't answer. Then she quietly told me she could hear the man walking again. She also heard someone shouting. When I asked if she thought it was her father, she said she couldn't tell anymore. It's too loud. At almost the same moment, Maria slid another newspaper clipping across my desk. This one wasn't about the fire itself. It was about the investigation afterward. According to the report, Sarah's father had managed to escape the burning house before realizing his daughter was still upstairs. Without thinking, he'd gone back inside. Firefighters later found him near the staircase. He'd been trying to reach the second floor, trying to reach Sarah. I looked back at the timer on my screen. The call had now been connected for 23 minutes. That was unusually long for an emergency call, especially one where we still had no address, no phone number, and no location. Mark quietly asked one of the technicians to run another trace. Nobody expected a different result. A few minutes later, the technician returned carrying a single sheet of paper. "I found something," he said. For the first time that night, I felt a small flicker of hope. He placed the page on my desk. The phone number field was blank. The carrier field was blank. The location field was blank. The only thing the system had managed to record was the connection time. 2:17 a.m., nothing else. It was as though the call had appeared out of nowhere. "Daniel." Sarah sounded weaker now. "I'm here. I think I can see light." "What kind of light?" "It looks orange." My heart sank. A moment later, she answered the question I hadn't wanted to ask. "The smoke is coming under my door." Nobody in the room had to say the word. Fire. I stood without realizing it before Mark gently pulled me back into my chair. There was still nothing we could send. No officers, no firefighters, no ambulance. Without a location, we had nowhere to send them. All I could do was stay with her. I told Sarah to get as low to the floor as she could and cover her mouth with her shirt if she was able to. She said she already was. Then she started coughing. Once, then again, then again. Everything else around me disappeared. The dispatch center, the monitors, the keyboards, the conversations happening across the room. None of it mattered anymore. There was only one frightened little girl and the impossible hope that somehow we could still save her. Then another voice came through the phone. Not the calm voice we'd heard before. This one was louder, desperate. "Sarah!" she gasped. "Dad?" The line exploded with noise. Wood splintering, people shouting, glass breaking, then silence, not static, not interference, just silence. I waited. "Sarah?" Nothing. I called her name again, and still nothing. A second later, the call disconnected. Nobody moved. For several long seconds, the entire dispatch floor was silent. Mark finally broke it. "Save the recording." The technician immediately tried. A minute later, he looked back at us. "It isn't there." "What do you mean? The recording never saved." "Check again." "I already have." Every emergency call was recorded automatically. Every single one, except this one. The system showed I'd spent 24 minutes on an active call, but there was no recording, no caller ID, no phone number, no trace, nothing. The only evidence the call had ever existed was the 6 of us who had heard it. I didn't sleep after my shift. Instead, I drove to where Ash Street used to be. The neighborhood was gone. A small public park stood where the houses had once been. Children laughed and played across the grass, as though nothing terrible had ever happened there. I eventually found a weathered memorial plaque near a row of trees. It listed the names of everyone who had died in the fire. Near the bottom were 3 names. Michael Turner, Emily Turner, Sarah Turner. Someone had left a small bouquet of white flowers beneath the plaque. As I stood there reading the names, an elderly groundskeeper pushed a wheelbarrow past me. He noticed the memorial and slowed down. "Sad story," he said. "It happened a long time ago." I nodded. "I heard the little girl never made it out." He looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Little girl?" He pointed toward the plaque. "The only child who died here was a boy." I frowned and looked back down. My eyes stopped on the last name. I'd read it wrong. Not Sarah. Samuel. The groundskeeper continued on his way, leaving me standing there alone. I looked at the plaque again. The name hadn't changed. It still said Samuel. For months, I convinced myself exhaustion had played tricks on me, that I'd misread the newspaper, misread the memorial, that the impossible phone call had been nothing more than some bizarre technical failure. Eventually, I almost believed it. Until 6 months later, I was working another night shift. The clock on my monitor changed to 2:17 a.m. My headset chimed. I clicked accept without thinking. Before I could say a single word, a little girl's voice whispered, "Please, don't hang up."